So I was able to do that and push these inmates as hard as I could to find out what these voices were and how they operated. Okay? And you were asking about one with a positive voice. This one fella, he was from San Diego. He had a big rap sheet. I mean, he'd been in trouble with the law a million times, and he was thrown into prison finally. And he had been using cocaine in San Diego, California, and he was already hearing voices. And one day the voices told him, they said, "Hey, we know where there's a Sesame pot field up in Oregon." Okay, so that's about 1,000 miles from where he was at. And they said, "Get yourself a machete and 2 burlap sacks, and we'll show you where it is." So this guy was used to listening to the voices. And he got a machete and 2 burlap sacks, and he drove all the way up to Oregon and just followed every turn that these voices told him. And he ended up on a dirt road that was like 23 miles long, and it dead ended into a mountain. So he stopped there, and he goes and he asked the voices. He said, "There's no more road. What now?" And the voices told him, "There's a hiking trail about 50 yards to your left. Walk down there, you'll see it. Take your burlap sacks and your machete." So he walked down there and he saw it. And he started up the trail, and they said, "Yeah, that's the right trail. Just keep walking." So he walked for a few hours, and finally he got up into the mountain, and there was this giant Sesame pot field there, just like the voices had told him. Okay. So he went, he cut down, their marijuana. He put it in these burlap sacks and took it back down the mountain. And he asked the voices, he said, "Okay, what do I do with it?" And they said, "Well, there's a national park. I know, I'll tell you where it is. You can sell it there." So he goes there to the national park and he starts selling the marijuana, and he made a lot of money. And he bought all the drugs he could handle. He bought all the alcohol he wanted. He bought all the prostitutes he wanted. And then the voices told him they wanted to go fishing. So that they were fishermen. When he told me that, I went, "Oh, get out of here. You're pulling my leg. That's too far now." He goes, No. He goes, "Honest to God, they wanted to go fishing." He said, "I bought a fishing rod, went out to the river, and they told me what bait to hook. They told me where to throw the hook. They told me how long to stay there and when to move on." He said he was the only one catching fish in the Columbia River that day. So that went on for, like 2 weeks. And then another time he ran out of money. He went up there and he got another couple of sacks. And then the third time when he ran out of money, he said, "Okay, I need to go back up there again and get some more." And the voices told him, "Nope, don't do that. They're waiting for you. They know you've been robbing them. They're going to kill you if you go up there. Take your machete and your car and whatever money you have left and go back to San Diego." So he did, and he got away with it. So that was one of the stories he told me while
Interesting.
I was working with him. But then he said he kept hearing the voice of his mother, and his mother was deceased. And I was curious, and also leery, because these voices can take the form of anybody they want. They can mimic anybody. They know stuff. They can go into the person's mind and pull up every rotten thing they've ever done and throw it in their face until they generate this negative emotional energy. And they can fake like anybody, But for the most part, they don't sound any different than the voice you hear in your head thousands of times a day. There's no, "Where are the voices?" It's not like that. It sounds just like the regular thoughts that go through your head, only they're very different. They're consistently negative. They're malicious, and they don't have the same intent that the person has for themselves. Okay, so these things can mimic anybody. So I was suspicious when he started telling me that his mother was talking to him. I'm going, well, that could be one of them. And I said, "Does she ever tell you anything bad? She ever tell you anything negative?" And he said, No, she doesn't ever say anything like that. And I said, "Well, what does she tell you?" He says, "Well, she tells me to stay away from the gangsters and don't take drugs and wear clean underwear and take showers and the kind of stuff a mother would say." And I'd ask him every time he said he heard his mother, I'd ask him that. There was never anything negative to it. He said that she would come and she could chase away the weaker voices, but she would disappear when the stronger ones showed up. So I found that interesting.
Could she have been some sort of protector? Because I have come across, because, I do energy healing, and I have come across people who have had interference in their field, and they're people who supposedly should have passed on, but they actually say, "No, I'm here because I'm protecting this person from a demonic entity or from a witch." So that's what it sounds like.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. And what you need to test them and ask them if that person ever says anything negative or derogatory to them. Even one statement blows that, because they can fake like anybody. I got another story of that too. But when this guy finally recovered, okay, so after about 9 months, the voices were gone. Okay, completely gone. He was back to normal.
How did he recover?
Well, what we were doing was, back then I didn't know what I knew now. So we were throwing at them everything they didn't like. And there were a lot of things they didn't like. They didn't like the 23rd Psalm. They didn't like the Bible. They didn't like preachers. They wanted the person to watch murder mysteries and war stories and read all that negative stuff. Let me see, what else were they wanting? They wanted the person isolated, just listening to them. They wanted all family ties and friendships broken. Okay. They didn't want to be ignored. They didn't want to be interfered with. They didn't want the person exercising or eating right or, all these positive things that you need to do.
Yes.
Then they were consummate liars. So one thing we found is they lie about everything. You can't trust anything those negative voices say, nothing. And I'd ask patients, I'd go, well, if you know you can't trust them, why do you listen to them? And their response was always, you know, because they're so damn convincing.
Yes,
Yeah.
and often I'm just wondering if it's the same thing, because I believe I had a gin at one point, because all of this is very familiar and it all sounds absolutely correct, that they actually have a very heavy energy field.
Yes.
So it's quite difficult to go against it, even if you still have some sense of internal willpower, which is still there. It's overridden by the magnitude of the force. That's what I felt.
It depends on how strong they are.
Right.
You know, and they do go after people like you.
Yes.
You know, so you know what they are.
Yes.
You know, so that was a good education for you. You know,
it was a huge education. Yes.
you know, so this guy, when we finished up with him, the voices were gone. And it was like the last session I had with him. He said, my mom wants to talk to you. And I was like taken aback. You know, I'm like, well, she's, you know, she's always been there, because I'd ask him about her every time. So, you know, I'd always seen her in the background, but she never spoke to me, and neither did any of them speak to me directly, the voices, until one day when they did, and that changed everything. Okay. But in this case, he said, my mom wants to talk to you. And I said, well, okay, what you got to say? And you know, he was translating for her. She said, thank you for helping my son. You know, I greatly appreciate it. And I said, you're welcome. I said, well, what are you doing over there? She says, I'm checking people in. You know,
yes, that sounds familiar. Yes.
And I went, well, that's interesting. So I went to ask her another question, and she said, I'm not supposed to be talking to you. Everything you need to know is in the Bible. That's what came through her. You know, so that was one positive voice. But they're rare. They usually speak in feelings and intuition, and not directly in words.
And so we're establishing they're demonic. And would you say that they're all the same demonic strand, or are there different entities?
There's different kinds of entities. You know, some of them have never been human. You know, I remember asking them, have you ever been in a human body? And they said no. Some of them are just taken over humans that have kind of been trapped or have been evil all their lives, and just picked up from there. Some of them are just lost souls. You know, they got lost, and they never made it back. You know, so they're roaming around looking for somebody to attach to. They're not as destructive as these negative, you know, demonic type, but they still don't belong, and they still cause trouble. You know, and then there's echelons of them. It's not just one. You know, it's like an army. You know, there's the foot soldiers who are assigned to destroy certain people, and then there are the ones above them that they control the ones underneath. And if they're not doing enough damage, they're removed and replaced by somebody who's going to do more damage. You know? And those guys are pretty much untouchable. I remember one day we were working with one prisoner where he had two voices. We got rid of them, and then the whole time I was working with him, it was two voices. You know, so I figured that's all there were. So we got rid of those two, and then all of a sudden he says, "Okay, there's another one." I said, "Where did he come from?" And he said, "Well, that's the supervisor of the ones you got rid of, and they're pissed. They're angry." You know, so I tried to deal with that one. He wanted nothing to do with me. So yeah, there's echelons of them. There's different grades of them, going up to very malevolent.
Yes, yes. And so there's so much I want to ask you. So are we saying now there is, or for you, do you feel there's definitely this war between light and dark going on for people's souls?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. I mean, clearly.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, and the higher you can push your vibration, the less likely they are to get you. But you look what psychiatry is doing. You know,
keeping everyone in a low vibration.
Keeping everybody at a low vibration, drugging them senseless.
Yes.
Where their chances of recovering, you know, on their own are virtually nil. You know, so, you know, instead of going to a mace therapist that can get rid of the body of negative energy that they feed off of, people are convinced that psychiatry is the only place to go. You know, and they keep that going. Of course,
well,
you look
yes.
Here in the U.S., you turn on the TV and you got drug commercials, wall-to-wall drug commercials, you know, for everything, including psychiatric drugs. You know, and they show these people smiling and laughing. No, that's not how it is. I mean, even if they're on those drugs, they're still feeling like crap.
Yes.
You know, the antipsychotics are major tranquilizers.
Yeah.
You know, and they're toxic. They're actually causing damage to the central nervous system with long-term use.
Yeah, it's a trap, isn't it? It's actually a trap.
It's a trap. And a lot of those antidepressants are addictive. And I suspect they make them that way. Yeah. And it goes deeper than you might think. This DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, Psychiatry's Bible, you open it up and here's every psychiatric disorder known to man. There's not one objective test for even one of them.